"You either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain," is a popular quote by Harvey Dent from The Dark Knight. This quote is one that displays Arvis's life, but in reverse. He lived for the people and became the villain for their sake, only to die a hero at the very end, his praises unsung. We always see the plot through the eyes of the main character. In Genealogy of the Holy War, the player follows the path of Sigurd, believing him to be good, and sees the interactions between him and the other characters through his eyes. But at what point does this become biased? Is it possible that our main character was not entirely righteous? Or even that our antagonists also had a valid cause? In this video, as you can probably tell from the title, I'm going to attempt to piece the plot together from an alternate perspective. Unfortunately, this cannot be done without some major spoilers for Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War. You have been warned. For the sake of organization and linearity, I will be splitting this video into 4 major parts.
Part 1.
The genealogy of Arvis. Who is he?
Part 2.
How aware was Arvis of the plot?
Part 3.
The real villains. Who is really to blame?
Part 4.
Final conclusions.
Part 1.
To really understand who Arvis is, we must first look at his background. Arvis is the firstborn son of the Duke of Veltomer, Victor, and the Duchess of Veltomer, Sigurd, who also happens to be a descendant of the dark god Gale. Arvis's father Victor was a known womanizer and drunkard, and had many mistresses. But the major root of the conflict starts with him, whereby, in one of his drunken nights, he has a non-consensual engagement with one of Sigurd's maids, and gets her pregnant. He tries banishing her, but Sigurd forbids him from doing so, and as time goes on, Sigurd would eventually get fed up with his actions, and fall in love with Prince Kurth, who had supported her all along. Victor would then discover this affair, and commit suicide, leaving behind 7-year-old Arvis, fatherless. Sigurd would also run off after this and hide away in the spirit forest of Verdane, where she gives birth to Kurth's daughter, Deirdre. From the very young age of 7, Arvis has become both fatherless and motherless because of this conflict, and is raised by the very maid that Victor had an affair with. This maid is also the mother of his half-brother Azel. Now, I don't know about you guys, but seeing a child at the age of 7 have his family torn up before his very eyes is quite tragic. It is of no surprise that someone that has been subjected to such a cruel fate as a child would grow into an idealist. And sometimes, idealism may come at a price, even if the price is the lives of others. As the saying goes, the needs of the many outnumber the needs of the few.
To make my ideals a reality, I'd sacrifice anything. Or anyone.
These events all transpired several years before the start of our initial conflict, but I feel it's important for us to get a complete picture about the man who was so central to the events that transpired. Or so we believe. And this leads me into the next part of the video.
Part 2.
How aware was Arvis about what was actually transpiring? The plot begins with a very simple spark, or so it seems. Isaac and the Grand Bell Empire are at war, with Prince Kurth leading the forces alongside Sigurd's father Violen. In their absence, the Kingdom of Verdane seized the opportunity and invades Jungby Castle, neighbor to Chalfie, where Sigurd resided. Naturally, Sigurd rises to the defense and retaliates. It is in this very battle that we first catch a glimpse of Arvis. Sent by King Asmur, Arvis is there to provide Sigurd with his full support. He gives him a silver sword, and even entrusts the care of his younger brother Azel to Sigurd, showing that he deeply cares for his brother. Arvis then leaves, and departs back to Grandbell. This brief, yet simple interaction between Arvis and Sigurd shows that at this point in time, they harbor no animosity towards each other, and that Arvis even trusts Sigurd enough to allow him to care for his brother. In the following chapter, we begin to see the true causes of the plot, and The timing of the true cause is important in relation to Arvis's involvement. In a conversation between Quan and Eira, who is the daughter of the king of Isaac, it is revealed that the attack on Darna was not coordinated by the king himself, but rather by the leader of another town called Rivo, who acted on his own. The king of Isaac executed this leader, and went to the front lines to negotiate with the Grand Bell Empire. Unfortunately, he was suddenly assassinated on the front lines. This led the people of Isaac to retaliate in rage at the Grand Bell Empire, as they thought the assassination of their king was the Empire's doing, and thus, Kurth was in turn sent to retaliate. It is also at this point in the story that Sigurd accepts both Eira and her nephew and Prince of Isaac, Shannon, to their party. This will be an important detail in the events that follow. Another important occurrence in this chapter is the meeting between Sigurd and Deirdre. Now this is a very interesting point, since in 2 instances, and depending on how you decipher it, possibly 3, Sigurd is told about Deirdre's background. The first point is by a random villager, after he first runs into her, who reveals to Sigurd that the villagers believe a catastrophe will occur if Deirdre associates with men. Sigurd instantly calls this as superstitious nonsense, and disregards the first warning. The second point is in a more obscure conversation that occurs only if Sigurd and Deirdre meet again after the final boss of the chapter, Sandima, is killed first. In this conversation, Deirdre clearly tells Sigurd that she has the blood of the Dark Lord within her, and is forbidden to be with a man, as well as the fact that there's a religious sect of Dark Lord worshippers seeking to resurrect him through her. To this, Sigurd says he'll protect her against all odds. Sure, let's fight logic with passion, because that definitely works every time, doesn't it? Ironically, here he also says, and I quote, "Dear Lord, if you deem our love for each other to be a sin, I beg of you punish me. I won't regret it, even if it means 1,000 slashes upon my heart." I think the Lord heard your prayers, Sigurd, and he answered quite fittingly. For the third instance of warning in this chapter, I'm willing to give Sigurd the benefit of the doubt, since it comes via a village visit conversation. In this village conversation, the story of Myra, who is a descendant of Lopt, who lived in the village in the Spirit Forest. It is also revealed that Sigurd is descended from him. Another important point here shows that Sigurd left the village to explore the outside world, and then came back to give birth to a child. Now, this is a bit more abstract, but if Sigurd had heard about this and was able to string 2 and 2 together, along with the previous warnings, he really should have just left Deirdre alone. In the following chapter, a lord from Grandbell arrives to speak with Sigurd regarding him harboring the Prince of Isaac and conspiring against the king. The latter is obviously untrue, but you can see why harboring the prince of a country they're at war with is slightly suspicious. Regardless, that isn't our point. In this conversation, the story about Victor, Sigurd, and Kurth is revealed as I've already discussed earlier, but what is more important is that here, Sigurd is specifically named. This is yet another red flag if we take into consideration the previous conversation from the village in the other chapter. Of course, it's entirely possible another army member visited the village and never told Sigurd about it at all, so I forgive him for this single instance. However, it should be noted here that Sigurd sympathizes with Kurth and Sigurd, but never with Arvis, despite knowing she was his mother. I don't know what to make of this. It's just an interesting tidbit. At this point in the video, I'm sure you're all going, but Link, what the hell does all of this have to do with Arvis? You're only talking about Sigurd and his interactions. Exactly. Up until this point, the entire plot is occurring without the involvement of Arvis at all. And thus, why this section is titled, "How Aware Was Arvis of the Plot?" But now it's time to get to that, as At the end of Chapter 2, we get some very interesting revelations. Near the end of the chapter, Manfroy appears and has a discussion with one of the other Dark Mages of the Loputoso sect. The Dark Mage informs him that he has witnessed the assassination of Prince Kurth. But what is really interesting is that Manfroy now infers that Arvis has been informed of the future direction that the cult has agreed to come to. Up until this very point, Arvis had no idea what was going on in terms of the underlying plot, and had no hand in furthering it. Manfroy also reveals that he is blackmailing Arvis by threatening to tell people that he has the blood of the Dark God in him as well. Now, I know most people would react by going, "So what? This is just rumors." But allow me to show you another village conversation that shows the severity of this discrimination against those of that specific lineage. In this village conversation in Chapter 2, it is clearly shown that those of Loputoso descent are gathered in large villages and burned at the stake for doing absolutely nothing other than existing. You can imagine the repercussions this would have on the career of an idealistic man such as Arvis, who wants to create a better world. I'm sure he also doesn't want to be burned at the stake. It's his job to do the burning after all. At this point, we reach an interesting moment in the story where the plot becomes a bit convoluted from an analysis standpoint. We have a major turning point, the assassination of Prince Kurth, shown from 3 different perspectives. The first we have previously addressed, with a Loputoso mage informing Manfroy of the assassination, and Manfroy approving and saying how they now have Arvis on their side. The second is from the point of view of Lombard and Reptor, who are 2 lords who were opposed to Prince Kurth and wanted power for themselves. It is shown in this conversation that Lombard himself was the one who killed Kurth. However, it is what Reptor says that is most interesting. Reptor here compliments Lombard on his intelligence, but also seems to say that Arvis was the one who planned this. I'm not too sure, and we'll revisit. The third is from the point of Bishop Claude. He prays to the tower, and it shows him a vision of what happens. In this vision, it shows that Reptor was the one who planned it, and that Lombard was the one who assassinated Prince Kurth. He also references a wicked force in the shadows, most likely referring to the Loptus clan. In my attempt to keep this factual, and not come off as an Arvis apologist, I'm showing you all 3 points of reference to this event to allow you to draw your own conclusions. In terms of my own opinion, I think I would go with the word of the divine, being Bishop Claude in this case, as opposed to the accounts of 2 mortal men. I'd also like to think that Arvis would not directly harm those who took care of him after he'd lost his parents, but also that Manfroy must have been orchestrating it for a while. The way Manfroy replies to Kurth's death, with Arvis being on board now, leads me to think that these 2 things are possibly working in parallel and not in sequence. During this chapter, we also see the kidnapping of Deirdre, where Manfroy finds her, and subsequently, in the next chapter, it is revealed that Arvis had been wed to Kurth's daughter. By this time in the story, for those who are attentive, it's obvious that Deirdre is Kurth's daughter, and so we kind of already know what's going on. In the last chapter of the First Generation, we finally start to hear things directly from Arvis himself. We get to see a conversation between him and King Asmur, where he recounts the story of Kurth's murder at the hands of Violin and Ring, and how Reptor and Lombard were the ones who witnessed it. This is a false accusation, and is most likely due to his fear of Manfroy's blackmail. We also hear the story about how Arvis and Deirdre got married. Arvis found her unconscious with no memory outside the castle grounds. He initially took her in out of sympathy, but then fell in love with her and married her. He was unaware of her lineage or origins at all, until King Asmur himself recognized the mark of Naga on her. Manfroy also makes an appearance in this chapter, where Arvis very clearly tells him that he has put up with their antics and will allow them to coexist as he creates a world free of prejudice. He makes it very clear that he's not willing to let the Dark God take control. This shows that Arvis is not inherently evil, and knows that Manfroy is no saint. There's also a very interesting part of the conversation here between Manfroy and Arvis, where Arvis mentions Sigurd knowing too much, and him being a sacrifice to the greater good. Manfroy replies with, "I assume that greater good includes Deirdre as well. Lord Arvis, you're afraid, aren't you? Afraid her memories may be restored." Now, this could imply two things. The majority of people seem to think that by now, Arvis already knows that Deirdre was Sigurd's wife, and that's why he's afraid of her memories being restored, and that is what is implied by Manfroy in this conversation. That Arvis is afraid that Deirdre may remember that Sigurd was her original husband if Arvis doesn't kill him. In contrast, we really don't know how Arvis would know this at all. The game doesn't show any correspondence between the two, and certainly very minimal contact between Sigurd and the rest of Grand Bell in general. And then we all know what happens next. Arvis pretends to support Sigurd, lures him in, and brings Deirdre out for him to see before killing him. Again, this is another point in which people will say that Arvis brought her out to confirm that she's his wife, or to taunt him. I don't really see it because of the previous analysis, but maybe that's me looking at this through tinted lenses. Of course, for the sake of being unbiased, I had to dive deeper into this and investigate the truth. I found a translation of the Genealogy of the Holy War playing guide on Serenus Forest that seems to be a canon expansion on this part of the story. The guide says that after marrying Deirdre, Arvis noticed that she often seemed to be another person, and he became afraid that one day she would leave his side just like his mother did. Gripped by this thought, he lived his days with great unease and heard rumors that Sigurd's wife had gone missing, leading him to carefully watch Sigurd. And so during the final chapter, he progressed with his plan to let Deirdre meet Sigurd due to his inability to let go of his endless worry. He obviously shouldn't have checked, but he was unable to control himself. Following that, he investigated Deirdre's past, traveling to the Spirit Forest, and ultimately found out that she was Sigyon's daughter. Of course, for those that have only played the game, it's impossible to realize any of this. After the Battle of Barhara, and the annihilation of Sigurd's army, Arvis now has control of the entire continent, and unifies it, making him the Emperor. And for a while, everything is prosperous and peaceful. Arvis had succeeded in his dream of making a better world that was free of prejudice. Even Luin, who survived the Battle of Barhara, acknowledges Arvis' success. However, that would not last. Eventually, his son Julius, who had inherited both minor Loputoso blood from his mother and father to have major holy blood of Loputoso, was given the Book of Loputoso and became possessed by the Dark God. How Julius has gotten complete control of everything in this game is not well explained at all, but it seems that he was controlling the rest of Yggdrasil through the actions of the corrupt lords of each area outside of Arvis' jurisdiction and knowledge. Throughout the entirety of the second generation, not once is it mentioned that Arvis is a bad ruler, only that the regent lords are. In Chapter 7, Luin yet again brings up a very wise point in his conversation with Seliph about the Loputoso clan and how they were probably normal people. Luin states, "You have to be careful when placing labels on good and evil, Seliph. Never waste your anger on individuals. Always focus it on the evil within all of us." The majority of the second generation is spent roaming around the world and beating up the lords in each area, with very little focus on Arvis and the main villains up until the second to last chapter, Chapter 10. In this chapter, Arvis is shown very blatantly opposing the child hunts by setting the children in the castle free, and upon hearing Seliph approaching the castle, gives the holy Tirfing to Bishop Paulmark to send to Seliph. It also shows a man named Philippe, who was working under Arvis the whole time to keep all the children safe and away from Julius during the child hunts. We also see Arvis giving Julia her mother's circlet, which would later on be a key to retrieving the hidden book of Naga to fight Julius with. In this sequence of events, a lot of people like to point the finger at Arvis being a bad father for not keeping Manfroy away from Julius, or a bad ruler for not killing Julius right away. Well, I'd like to see how easy it is for a father to kill his own children. I'm sure it's terribly difficult. But even if he wanted to, due to the damage formula of Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War, and Loputoso's book Effect, Arvis would actually deal 0 damage to Julius, making him practically immortal and tying Arvis's hands. In the end, we see Arvis give the rebellion the weapons they need to bring down the Dark God, and he dies a very remorseful death. He seems to have known that the path he chose did not go accordingly, and eventually accepted his fate honorably. Now, I know what you're saying. Link, you took us on a journey to show us that Arvis wasn't really evil this whole time, but you said earlier there are real villains in Genealogy of the Holy War? That's right. That brings me to the most fun part of this video analysis.
Part 3.
Who are the real villains, and who is really to blame? In this part, I'm going to give you the names of the 6 people who I deem to be the most responsible for the progression of Genealogy of the Holy War's plot. I'll start from the least responsible and move upwards.
Number 6.
Sigurd. Yep, if the title of this video is going to be Arvis did nothing wrong, you better bet that Sigurd is most definitely not getting off for free here. I only have one major issue with Sigurd, and that's why he ranks so low on this list. Despite being told 2, and in some instances 3 times, of who Deirdre is and what her background is, he refused to listen, and still decided to take her out of the forest and marry her anyways. He exposed her to the outside world, and without this exposure, our plot literally cannot progress. Had he left her alone, and continued his bloody conquest of Yggdrasil without her, it's likely that none of this would have happened.
Number 5.
Deirdre. If Sigurd is guilty for being told about the prophecy thrice, then Deirdre is even more guilty for knowing who she is and what the Loputoso sect is trying to do with her. Not much more to really emphasize here. She allows herself to become a plot device and is blinded by emotion. I don't blame her for marrying Arvis though, as she had amnesia, but for the prior, it's still enough to merit her being to blame for the plot.
Number 4.
Manfroy. I know what you all are thinking. How are there 3 people above Manfroy? Surely he's the source of all evil. Well, true, he is the mastermind behind the operation, and the one who put all the plans into action. He pulled the strings so perfectly, and made sure his plan worked without fail. But the matter of fact remains, there are others that are more to blame, and with that...
Number 3.
Kurth. Yes, Kurth. This guy knew Sigurd was a married woman. Regardless of what she was subjected to, you can't just have an affair with a married woman. He also was the father of Deirdre, who in turn was used as a plot device. Due to facilitating this, he allowed Manfroy to grasp that and use it to fuel the revival of the Dark God, and for that, I rank him above Manfroy as a direct cause.
Number 2.
Victor. Remember this guy? This guy is a total deadbeat. Alcoholic, womanizer, every bad word in the dictionary. All he did was cause harm, and he single-handedly influenced the relationship between Sigurd and Kurth, which is why he's ranked number 2. But he's not number 1. Why? Well, I think you already know where I'm going with this, but...
Number 1.
Sigurd. Oh boy. Where, oh where do I start with this one? Yes, Sigurd is who I deem to be the real villain of Genealogy of the Holy War. Why? Well, I'll tell you. On the surface, the young girl seemed like an innocent descendant of the Dark God who just wanted to leave the forest, realize her dream to experience the world, and break free of her shackles. She knew the prophecy, and she didn't care. She knew the consequences, and she didn't care. She married a man, and she didn't care. She had an affair with another, and she didn't care. And then she returned to her home as if nothing happened, without informing them of anything that happened in her previous life. Don't you think that if there's an entire prophecy about you having children, with a possibility of reviving the Dark God, it might be important to mention you had a son? Also, I don't know what Victor was like in his earlier years, but as a woman free from the confines of court, surely she could have chosen a better husband. Regardless, what she was forced to undergo was terrible at the hands of Victor, and for that she has my sympathy in this one point. Why do girls always go for the bad boys? I'll never understand. However, the fact remains that if Sigurd had not left the forest, had not married Victor, and had not had an affair with Kurth, nothing in this plot would have been able to occur. All three of these points are required for the plot to happen, and she was single-handedly responsible for making an informed decision in all three of them. And with that, we move on to the final point in the video, which is
Part 4.
My final conclusions. I started this video with the title Arvis Did Nothing Wrong, because I wanted it to be bold and thought-provoking. I wanted people to come into the video expecting a different point of view to the story that is usually told, and I hope I was able to provide that. As for my own personal conclusions, no, I don't think Arvis did nothing wrong. Arvis actually had a number of mistakes throughout the story. Giving Sigurd the silver sword, trusting a blackmailer, and not doing his proper research about lineages. But having said that, I don't think he is the most to blame in this narrative at all, as I have just explained by my villains ranking. At the end of the day, this is a man who, due to his lineage, had sworn to establish a world free of prejudice, and was abused by the very people he was trying to help. He became a villain in order to establish peace, and then lived long enough to see himself become the hero that was instrumental in aiding our protagonist group in defeating the villains. And thus, I end with my new-formed quote: "You either die a villain, or live long enough to see yourself become a hero." Arvis is more known as the first, but through this video, I hope to have shown you the possibility that he may really have been the hero we needed, but didn't deserve. Thank you everyone who made it this far in the video. I really hope that this was able to provide something new and fresh for all of you. This is my first time attempting something like this for Fire Emblem, so please let me know what you thought of it in the comments, and if I changed your mind, or at least gave you something to think about you hadn't seen or heard before. I'd appreciate all the feedback I can get, and let me know if you'd like to see more of these. I had a lot of fun doing this. And thanks for watching.